There is a grave at Normandy that doesn't belong to a soldier. Plot A, row 21. Grave 5. The stone reads Elizabeth A. Richardson, American Red Cross, and if you didn't know better, you'd walk right past it. One more white cross among 9,387. But stop for a second. Read it again. She was 27 years old. She never carried a rifle. She never wore a combat patch. And she is buried here, among the men who stormed the beaches for miles from where she now rests, because for 11 months she drove a truck full of doughnuts and coffee to the edge of the fighting and back, day after day, until a small plane went down in the fog near Rouen and took her with it. Somewhere in a filing cabinet in Washington, there's a report that tries to explain why the German army lost the war in the West. It was written by American intelligence officers in the summer of 1945, based on interrogations of the men who had run that war from the German side. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the most senior commander on the Western Front, sat across the table from his captors and gave 3 answers. Allied air power, which made daylight movement suicide. The collapse of fuel supply, which grounded the tanks and the planes. And the destruction of the rail network, which meant nothing could move where it needed to move, when it needed to move there. 3 answers. Clean, professional, and true. And missing something. He never mentioned the trucks. Not the ones hauling shells and gasoline, those he understood perfectly. The other trucks. The ones that carried a doughnut machine, a coffee urn, a stack of records, and 3 young American women who had crossed an ocean to stand at a crossroads in the rain and ask a 19-year-old rifleman where he was from. Rundstedt didn't leave that out because he was hiding something. He left it out because he genuinely could not see it. Nothing in his training had a category for it. The German war machine had a word for firepower, a word for maneuver, a word for supply. It had no word for a truck that drove 3 miles behind the front line, full of pastries, for no reason that had anything to do with winning a battle, and everything to do with winning a war. This is the story of that truck. And it starts, strangely enough, not in 1944, but almost 30 years earlier, on her knees, in the mud, in a different war entirely. October 1917. Eastern France. A village called Montier-sur-Saulx, where it had rained for 36 straight days. The men of the 1st Division had been sitting in that mud so long that morale wasn't dropping anymore, it had bottomed out. 2 Salvation Army volunteers, Ensign Helen Purviance and Ensign Margaret Sheldon, had been doing what they could. Mending uniforms, reading letters, baking whatever the ration allowance would allow. But pie needed an oven they didn't have, and the men were sick of the same tired rations. So they went looking through what little they could find: flour, sugar, lard, a tin of baking powder, and somebody suggested doughnuts. There was no cutter, so they used the ring of a baking powder tin and the mouth of a bottle. There was no rolling pin, so they used a wine bottle instead. The frying pan was so small it could only hold 7 at a time, which meant Purviance had to crouch on a dirt floor in a leaking tent, feeding a fire with one hand and turning dough with the other. I was literally on my knees, she said afterward, when those first doughnuts were fried, 7 at a time, in a small fry pan. The first one went to a soldier from Alabama. He took a bite, and according to the story that outlived the war, said something like, "If this is what war tastes like, don't stop it." They made 150 doughnuts that first day, 300 the next. Word moved through the division, then the Corps, then the whole American Expeditionary Force, and within weeks Salvation Army stations up and down the line were frying doughnuts by the thousands, some of them cooked in steel helmets over open fire, wherever a working stove couldn't be found. The men started calling the women who made them the Doughnut Girls. The name stuck to the whole idea. And when the war ended and those soldiers came home, they carried the memory of the mud, the gas, the shelling, and, somehow, right alongside it, the memory of a warm doughnut handed to them by someone who had crossed an ocean for no reason except that she thought they mattered. Nobody in that flooded tent in 1917 could have told you they were inventing a doctrine. But they were. And 25 years later, when America went to war again, this time on an industrial scale nobody in history had ever attempted, somebody remembered. His name was Harvey Gibson, a New York banker who had served with the Red Cross in France during the First War, and who was now running Red Cross operations for the American forces gathering in Britain. Gibson had watched what a handful of Salvation Army women had managed to do with a wine bottle and a tin can. And he asked a very simple, very American question: what happens if you take that same idea and build a machine around it? The answer was the Clubmobile. The first ones were converted London double-decker buses, fitted with doughnut machines and coffee urns and a phonograph for music. But once the invasion of Europe began, the Red Cross needed something that could actually keep pace with an army fighting its way across a continent, so they took roughly 100 GMC 2.5-ton military trucks, the exact same trucks hauling ammunition and fuel to the front, and turned them into rolling kitchens. A doughnut machine bolted to the floor. A stove. An urn. A shelf of magazines. A little bench in the back where, for 10 minutes, a soldier could sit down out of the weather and talk to somebody who wasn't trying to kill him. The Doughnut Corporation of America loaned the Red Cross 468 machines. Each one could turn out 48 dozen doughnuts an hour. Run the numbers across every theater of the war, for years, and you start to understand the scale of it. In December of 1944 alone, 205 Red Cross women stationed in Britain served more than 4.5 million doughnuts. Before the fighting in Europe was over, Red Cross bakeries and Clubmobile crews would produce somewhere north of 200 million of them. But the machine needed people, and the Red Cross wasn't going to send just anyone. To staff a Clubmobile, a woman had to be a college graduate, single, between 25 and 35, and she had to pass a selection process that accepted roughly one applicant in 6, a tighter ratio than a lot of combat units. They trained at American University in Washington. They learned to drive and repair the trucks themselves, because nobody else was going to do it for them. And then they shipped out, 3 to a truck, to stand at the tailgate for hours at a time in rain, mud, and snow, pouring coffee and cracking jokes and remembering names, because that, the eye contact, the small talk, the being seen, was never a side effect of the mission. It was the mission. 10 Clubmobile groups landed at Normandy in the weeks after D-Day. Roughly 320 women drove their own trucks off the landing craft and into a country still being fought over field by field, draping their vehicles in green camouflage netting so German reconnaissance planes wouldn't spot the straight lines and come looking. They learned, the way soldiers did, to tell incoming fire from outgoing by the sound alone. And they kept driving, through the hedgerows of Normandy, through the liberation of Paris, through the worst German counter-offensive of the war. That December, when the Wehrmacht launched its last great gamble in the Ardennes forest, the offensive so violent it would come to be called the Battle of the Bulge, the Clubmobiles did not pull back. One of the crew still working that sector belonged to a young woman named Jill Pitts, on a truck called the Cheyenne. 2 days before the German attack began, she'd driven out to see her twin brother, Captain John Pitts, commanding an artillery battery near a town called St. Vith. It was the last time she'd see him. He was killed on the 16th of December, the opening day of the offensive. His sister found out while she was still serving coffee to soldiers a few miles behind a line that was, at that exact moment, on fire. She kept working. So did the rest of them. General George Patton, a man not exactly famous for sentiment, sent word to every Clubmobile crew in his 3rd Army sector that December, in my opinion, the Clubmobile girls of the American Red Cross have performed and are performing a very major work in maintaining the morale of the frontline troops. The 3rd Army joins me in a respectful and enthusiastic endorsement. Patton wasn't being polite. He was a general describing a weapon that worked. And it cost the women who ran it. 86 American Red Cross workers died in the Second World War. 52 of them were women. None of them were soldiers. None of them were required to be anywhere near a battlefield. They went anyway. Elizabeth Richardson was one of them, the Indiana schoolteacher's daughter who wrote home that Clubmobile life was rugged and irregular and weird and also, in the same letter, wonderful. She survived Normandy. She survived the Ardennes. She survived the whole war, right up until 2 months after Germany surrendered. When a small plane carrying her to Paris flew into fog near Rouen and never came out of it, now think about what the Germans built instead. They had their own morale system, front theater troops, rest houses, a radio network that made Lille-Moline famous on both sides of the line. Some of it genuinely worked. But every word of it ran through the propaganda ministry. There was no free press in a German foxhole, no equivalent of Stars and Stripes, the U.S. Army's own daily newspaper, which Eisenhower personally protected from censorship even when General Patton wrote it furious letters, and which published them anyway. There was no equivalent of the mobile Coca-Cola bottling plants that followed American troops across Europe and the Pacific, 64 of them by war's end, run by technicians the GIs nicknamed the Coca-Cola Colonels. And there was nothing at all, like a truck that crossed an ocean for the sole purpose of reminding a soldier that his country still knew his name. By the winter of 1944, the imbalance had become physical. German frontline rations, once a source of real pride, were stretched thin with fillers and substitutes, ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley, margarine standing in for butter, cigarettes rationed and often unavailable at all. When the Ardennes offensive kicked off, its entire plan depended on capturing American fuel dumps, because Germany no longer had enough of its own to run the attack. On December 17th, an SS unit under Joachim Paper overran a fuel depot at Bullingen, Belgium, and forced American prisoners of war to refuel German tanks with gasoline meant for someone else's army. Within days, Paper's advance stalled because even stolen fuel wasn't enough. That same week, a few miles away, the Clubmobiles were still running. After the war, British intelligence officers at a place called Trent Park had spent years secretly recording the private conversations of captured German generals, 84 of them, housed in comfort, given the run of the gardens, and never told about the microphones hidden in the walls. In those unguarded conversations, the generals circled the same question over and over: How had an army they dismissed in 1940 as soft and undisciplined managed to grind the Wehrmacht down field by field, mile by mile, all the way back to Berlin? They talked about air power, about tanks, about fuel. They never quite landed on the answer sitting at every crossroads behind the American line, because it wasn't a weapon their doctrine had a name for. The doughnut was never really about the doughnut. Flour, sugar, lard, you could make one in 4 minutes, and it never won a single battle. What it carried was the thing behind it, a country spending fuel, steel, shipping tonnage, and eventually the lives of the women who delivered it, just to put a warm meal and a familiar voice into the hands of a frightened kid a long way from home. Not because that kid needed calories. Because he needed to know somebody remembered he was still alive. Rundstedt gave 3 reasons Germany lost the war: air, fuel, rail. He was right about all 3. He just never saw the 4th one, parked at the crossroads, camouflaged under green netting, driven by a woman who volunteered to follow an army to war because she believed, without being able to fully explain why, that it mattered. He missed the truck, and in missing the truck, he missed the war. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many stories like this one. Most of them are about ordinary people who decided that someone had to do something and that the someone was going to be